been a very useful exercise for me to start to draw a narrative together and start to pull together past research on this topic, because I think, as we've heard from all our speakers, it's a topic that needs a great deal more work. It's a truism that all forms of military activity require clear and effective communications. At the lower of the warrior band or small unit, the human voice or hand gesture may be sufficient. In larger formations, more complex means of communications are required, including drums, whistles, pipes, flags, and runners. With the rise of the ancient empires, the control and command of forces became more difficult as the centres of power needed to keep in touch with their outlying frontiers. The Roman Empire developed a sophisticated system of roads and imperial messengers, and along its frontier a network of signal stations whose traces we may identify. The threat of Spanish invasion during the 16th century famously led to a system of early warning fire beacons, and as a means of long-distance communication remains essentially unchanged to the 18th century. The complexity of messages that could be communicated by a beacon were severely limited. This was to change with the invention of the visual telegraph system in 1793 by the Frenchman Claude Chappe, a system that was also dependent on improvements in current telescope technology. By the end of the decade, the Admiralty had installed a similar link between London and the naval dockyards, and they also tried a shutter system. Drawbacks of this system were problems of visibility during bad weather and at night. It was nevertheless a revolutionary technology that allowed messages to be conveyed at 300 to 400 miles per hour, and until the advent of the electric telegraph system, it remained the most effective method of long-distance communication. From the 1840s, the electric telegraph became increasingly important for business communications, its development closely tied to developing railway network, as we've heard. The military was quick to exploit this commercial technology, and a small unit of electric telegraph engineers were deployed to the Crimea in 1854. A year later, by linking through continental circuits, the field army was in touch with London by telegraph. Later, the combination of the railways and the telegraph were decisive factors in the Prussian victory of 1870 against France. By the 1880s, in London and other large conurbations, including Manchester, often competing telephone systems were becoming commonplace, although only serving a narrow business clientele. The War Office was also quick to exploit this technology, and in about 1890, a telephone conversation was recorded between the Royal Gunpowder Mills, Waltham Abbey, and the Royal Arsenal, Woolwich. Around the turn of the 20th century, the Royal Gunpowder Factory and the Royal Small Arms Factory, Enfield, were equipped with a telegraph-based alarm system manufactured by Siemens, perhaps supplied from their Woolwich factory. Similar pillars survive in Berlin and at Spandau. Remarkably, at Waltham Abbey, some of the late 19th century and early 20th century telegraph lines may still be traced. Many of the telegraph poles and insulators, some dating from the 1890s, are stamped with a government broad arrow and a date, and might offer an opportunity to refine Pope's 1973 type series of porcelain insulators. The telegraph was also an indispensable technology of imperial control. From 1870, the first of 14 submarine cables was landed at Port Curnow, Cornwall. In the 1890s, telegraph lines were strung out to link the main garrisons of the Sudan, and during the Boer War, new industrial products included corrugated iron, barbed wire, and the telegraph were an essential part of the essential policy of containing and containing the Boer population using a relatively small number of troops. This plan of the defence of the important communications centre at Springfontaine shows the various outposts linked by telephone. And during the Boer War, the army maintained around 28,000 miles of line and laid a further 18,000 miles of new line. In February 1897, Marconi, being unable to find financial backers for a wireless system or telegraph system, arrived in England to look for support. A year later, backed by his cousin Henry Jameson Davis, the Wireless Telegraph Company was formed, and typical of many nascent industries, took over a second-hand factory, a former silk mill in Hall Street, Chelmsford, marking the beginning of the electronics industry in the county. The military was quickly to seize on the potential of this new technology, In 1899, two Royal Navy cruisers, HMS Douro and HMS Europa, signalled to one another using Marconi equipment. 5 newly manufactured Marconi wireless sets were taken to South Africa, but there was no evidence they played a major part in the conflict. At the same time, wireless technology was deployed in the Boxer Rebellion, 1899 to 1901, and during the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, ships on both sides were equipped with wireless sets. To the colonial powers, it offered a cheaper and more flexible system than cable technology to link far-flung outposts. And as early as 1910, a wireless set was installed on board aircraft for the annual Salisbury Plain manoeuvres. Similar developments were reported in Germany and France, where they're also fitted to airships. The rising fortunes of the Marconi Company, in part built on large naval contracts, was expressed in this impressive Edwardian Baroque-fronted factory by W. Dunn and R. Watson, built in 1912 in Chelmsford. And in common with manufacturers of the period, to the rear were large and open North-like production sheds. By the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, communication by telephone and telegraph were established technologies. Given the scale of the Western Front, they were essential for the coordination of attacks and to ensure the smooth movement of men and supplies. This essentially static war, with its reliance on landlines, also changed the nature of leadership. To exercise effective command, the general and his staff now needed to be based at a communications hub. Despite complaints from frontline troops, if generals left the rear for the front, they might be able to command no more than a couple of companies. Landlines had a number of disadvantages, not least they were very vulnerable to be cut by shelling and often required repairing at high cost in lives. With poorly insulated lines, the earth acted as a conductor, enabling messages to be overheard by opposing forces. The British partly overcame this in 1916 with the introduction of a scrambler, the Fullerphone. But during the rapid advances of 1918, another drawback was revealed when landlines were rarely able to keep up with frontline units. One solution was the use of wireless sets, but contemporary equipment was heavy, bulky and fragile, which inhibited its wider use and led to its slow adoption by the army. In the trenches, the German army used 3 types of wireless instruments with ranges between 1,100 and 6,600 yards, and more powerful sets were available with a range of up to 190 miles. And by the end of the war, it operated hundreds of stations. They were particularly important in sectors where landlines had been severed by shell fire and joint offensive operations. Despite the flexibility of wireless communications, a major shortcoming was that unless careful radio discipline was maintained, it might be intercepted. And the French Marshal Joffre commented the German wireless stations were one of our most important sources of information. The destruction of the British Army's intercept records has left a major gap in the history of the Great War, and perhaps an underappreciation of its role in the land campaigns. On board ships, weight wasn't so critical, and the Royal Navy enthusiastically adopted wireless technology, so that by the outbreak of the war, 425 ships and 30 shore stations were equipped with wireless sets. The importance of long-range wireless communication was recognised by the belligerent powers. Remote wireless stations became legitimate targets, and the interception of their messages routine. The Navy also operated the system of intercept and direction finding stations, and the survival of documents from the Admiralty's Room 40 provides a far clearer impression of the naval conflict. At the outbreak of war, the Admiralty also took over Marconi's Hall Street factory in Chelmsford, as well as continuing wireless manufacture close by at the Broomfield Wireless Station. Research began into wireless interception. It was wireless intelligence that led to one of the greatest naval engagements of the war, when on the 30th of May 1916, an increase in wireless traffic from the German High Sea Fleet was detected following movement into the River Jade. This was taken as a clear indication the German fleet was prepared to set sail, and based on this, the Admiral of the fleet, Jackson, and incidentally an early wireless pioneer, he ordered the British Grand Fleet to sea. The following day, the two fleets met at Jutland. The Germans also routinely used radio navigation stations to direct their ships, submarines, zeppelins and aircraft. By 1915, the use of wireless in aircraft was sufficiently developed for 3 Royal Flying cause aircraft to be used as aerial spotters during the assault on Auber's Ridge. By the end of the war, 500 machines were equipped with wireless sets to communicate with 2,000 ground stations attached to artillery batteries. On the home front, the London Air Defence Area quickly developed a sophisticated air defence system with observer core posts, control centres, gun batteries, sound locators, searchlights and aerodromes, all linked by landlines, and a two-way radio link to fighters with a range of between 70 and 80 miles. Although many examples of Great War signalling equipment survive in museums, our knowledge of the exact locations, form and survival of the ground stations is very poor. Over the past decade or so, there have been an increasing number of excavations along the section's western front. A variety of telephone wires have been discovered, with a suggestion that the earliest wire may have been bare, while later examples are covered in lacquer or multi-strand type. Close to Beaumont Hamel, a disused trench was apparently used as a conduit for a telephone line. Here a line was found laid on duckboards and protected by sandbags. A remarkable find in the Ypres salient was the remains of a bamboo and cloth shutter system known as a flag wagger. Occasionally telephone wire is seen in contemporary films, in one instance impeding a machine gun crew, and in another tank is seen about to cut through a wire. Some of the most important technological developments since during the war, including the replacement of spark gap transmitters with pulse and arc transmitters, but more significant was the introduction of the thermionic valves that enabled development of voice telephony with a microphone fitted to the transmitter and headphones to the receiver. By the end of the war, wireless had been combined with other new technologies, including airships, tanks and aircraft, and the jamming and monitoring of communications was routine. But as Professor David Edgerton reminds us in his book, The Shock of the Old, despite the introduction of new technologies, for many tasks, established technologies continue to dominate. And one of the most enduring pictures of the war is an officer, pistol and whistle in hand, leading a futile charge. Alongside the new runners, whistles, signal rockets, lamps, flares, semaphore signals, flags and pigeons all continue to have a role. The Army's demand for new communications technology led directly to the establishment of a new industry. The war had also created a skilled cadre of trained personnel familiar with this new technology. And by the early 1920s, there were 500 firms that were manufacturing radio components, with a concentration of this new industry in the London area in the home counties, but with notable outliers such as Metrovic and Trafford Park. Over the next decade or so, commercial radio became firmly established, and there was an exponential rise in private wireless. It also became an essential business tool. In 1919, at North Weald in Essex, the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company acquired the late 19th century mobilisation centre to build the Ongar radio station. Its locally prominent position was as attractive to the radio engineers as the Army. When it opened in 1922, it was the most advanced radio station in the world, with the world speed record of 58 words per minute. It was the transmitter station, and receiver was built at Brentwood, with underground connections to the Central Telegraph Room in Wilson Street, London. Most of the radio station buildings to the northeast had been cleared prior to our survey, but its sparse remains are typical of many radio stations, with stripped buildings with some traces of their electrical fittings, the tethering blocks for masts and scatters of odd-shaped earthenware. By the 1930s, the transatlantic business messages by today's standards were extremely low, rising from 56 per day in 1932 to 102 per day in 1936. This steady rise in projections of future sunspot activity nevertheless prompted the General Post Office, in collaboration with Bell Laboratories, to begin work on the multiple unit steerable antenna. Shortwave communications system at the time was the ultimate in communications technology. The transmitter was based at Rugby and the receiver on Cooling Marshes, Medway, with corresponding facilities at Manahawk in New Jersey and Laurenville. At Cooling, the most substantial remains are of the equipment hall foundations. Its investigate demonstrates how a combination of techniques is often required to investigate communication sites. in this instance combining field survey, plotting the course of its 2-mile array and other features from aerial photographs, historical research, and collecting testimony from former employees. And in addition to wireless equipment purchased from private companies, the Army embarked on its own research programs. In 1916, the Signals Experimental Establishment was set up on Woolwich Common, perhaps attracted by the proximity of the well-established Siemens factory. In the early 1930s, the establishment employed around 100 people. Research included new wireless sets for the Army, internal and external communications for tanks, direction finding, artillery communications, secret wireless and cryptograph machines, fax transmission, and jam-proof wireless. But after some doubt about its future in 1934, the establishment was rebuilt, and a few of the 1930s buildings survive, although they face an uncertain future. During the late 1930s, it lost most of its staff to radar projects, and after the outbreak of war, some work was moved to Horsham, Surrey. The Woolwich works continued on the development of walkie-talkies and the evaluation of captured equipment. Eventually, the unit was moved to near Christchurch, Hampshire. The radio production unit then acquired the site for small, urgent production runs, skills that would later play an important role in the atomic bomb project. In Germany, the Army High Command in the 1920s and 30s, they recognised the importance that communications would play in any future war, and in the early 1930s embarked on an ambitious programme to relocate its central communications facility to a new bunker complex at Zossen to the south of Berlin. Most of the communications were structured around established telegraph and telephone systems, and the complex housed a vast array of facilities, including a long-distance telephone exchange, central teletype exchange for the Army and transport services, a long-distance control cable station, and supporting technical facilities. From Zossen, the High Command planned its campaigns and was able to keep in constant contact with the field armies. Although as the war progressed, I'm sure many field commanders may have wished for a less efficient system of communication that allowed them more freedom of action. The facility marked a major advance in the development of heavily protected and specialised structures to house sensitive communications equipment. Novel design features within the bunker include below-floor cable conduits, which also housed an internal pneumatic tube message system. Across its circuits in the last days of the war, news of the impending defeat was communicated, the basis of the reports for Heinz Guderian to deliver to an unreceptive audience in the Fiora bunker. Above ground, the buildings were rendered in a traditional German style, perhaps in part reflecting early concerns of the Heimatschutz, Homeland Protection movement, which sought both to preserve and modernise German traditions. In England, the Council of Protection Royal England reflects equivalent sentiments. During the interwar period, technologies that had been applied to the prosecution of the First World War, including the aeroplane, the tank, radio communications, came to maturity and shaped the campaigns of the Second World War. Churchill described radio as being at the heart of our war effort, and by the middle of the war, nationally, around 250,000 people were employed in the radio industry, representing a 5-fold increase in peacetime numbers. Production was increased at existing factories, but compared to other armament industries, production was more dispersed and often carried out in adapted buildings, and for security reasons, manufacture might be split between different sites. It was estimated that during the war, 12 million pieces of radio equipment were produced, while valve production rose from about 10 million per year to a peak of 38 million items, with most factories concentrated in and around in London. Tens of thousands of people also employed staffing and maintaining radio stations across the country and processing the information collected by the intercept stations. By the late 1930s, with the realisation that any future war, the country would be threatened by aerial attack, the scientific theory of radio location, or radar, was quickly developed into a practical means of aircraft detection and integrated into the air defence system. As well as producing communications equipment, the radio and electronics industry was crucial to the supply of radio direction finding equipment. In places such as Chelmsford, with established expertise in radio manufacture, factories were expanded and new ones built. During the Second World War, there was an exponential rise in the use of wireless equipment. In case of invasion, a clandestine stay-behind organisation, the auxiliary units had been formed. And in addition to their sabotage role, a special duties section was established to spy on the invader. They reported to the raw corps of signals detachment control stations, which were usually given the cover name of weather stations. In the event of invasion, they would shift to underground zero stations, often with an aerial chased into a nearby tree. At Rest Park, Bedfordshire, 2 trees exhibit such grooves. They may mark an unknown station, or they might be the right result of a lightning strike. The sites of a few of these Z stations are known, but for many we still lack detailed information on their precise locations. As secretive was the Radio Security Service. Its main task was to monitor the airwaves for illegal broadcasts being made from Britain. Its headquarters was initially at Wormwood Scrubs Prison, before it moved to a large house at Barnet, Hertfordshire, with an intercept station and an adjacent house. In 1941, it was renamed Special Communications Unit No. 3. A new intercept station was planned for Hanslope Park, Buckinghamshire, and 3 stations belonging to the General Post Office were taken over. New direction finding stations were built at Bridgewater, Somerset, and Wymanhen in Norfolk. At the latter site, during the 1970s, a farmer discovered and removed the galvanised metal chamber that the listeners lived in. To maintain contact with their agents, the Special Operations Executive ran 3 stations at Tame, Grendon Underwood and Henley in Oxfordshire, and many of the governments in exile and resistance groups also operated their own dedicated radio stations. Activities we at present know very little about. To these we might also add the various electronic navigation systems such as G and stations designed to distort German radio navigation systems. On the increasingly mechanised battlefield, radio played a crucial role in the coordination of units. During the build-up of the Panzer armies, Guderian was particularly concerned that each tank was fitted with a radio receiver and command tanks with transmitters. Smaller and more compact radio sets also revolutionised small unit engagements, enabling commanders to speak directly to their units and for support fire to be more closely coordinated. In the British Army, the man-portable wireless set number 18 gave a platoon commander while on the move the ability to communicate across a range of 2 to 6 miles and if stationary up to 8 miles. Towards the end of the war, some units were given the smaller number 38 sets, which have an effective range of about 4 miles. By the D-Day invasion in June 1944, the United States Army was liberally equipped with man-portable walkie-talkies and handy-talkies. German forces were also well equipped with radio equipment, although it is interesting to note the greater use of wooden and Bakelite casings, perhaps a response to material shortages. Fixed links that were more secure and reliable also remained crucial, and during the war the raw call of signals consumed nearly 3.5 million miles of cable. It has been recognised from the early days of wireless communications that transmissions were vulnerable to interception by hostile listeners and coding became commonplace. By 1918, Arthur Swerbus, a German engineer, devised the Enigma machine, which with a combination of rotor wheels and electrical connections was able to generate a huge number of code combinations. It was originally designed as a business machine, but by 1936 had been adopted by the German Navy and later other services. In the United Kingdom, a vast organisation grew up to intercept German signals, with the services, Foreign Office and GPO all running stations. About 80 Y stations served the government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park, which were variously sited in country houses in their grounds and new hutted camps. Although hand lists exist for their rough locations, it is not known if they all followed the standard form or used standard buildings. Prior to the war, the Army's intercept station was Fort Bridgewater, Chatham, a 19th century fort now demolished. RAF activity was initially centred at Cheadle, Cheshire, where it was concentrated on gathering tactical data. It also run another station at West Kingsdown, Sussex. The Army later moved to its main activities to a country house at Chicksounds, Bedfordshire, which it shared with an RAF unit, and other Army units operated from Aldershot and Cadleston Hall. As the RAF presence at Chicksands increased, the Army moved to a new purpose-built centre at Bow Manor, Leicestershire. Here, most unusually, the buildings were designed to appear like the buildings of a country estate. Around 1,300 people were employed here by 1945, and this complex is listed. The Navy also operated a number of intercept and direction finding stations which played a crucial role in attempting to locate U-boats and surface vessels and reroute shipping accordingly. At the heart of the clandestine radio stations in the South Midlands was Bletchley Park, home to the principal section of the Government Code and Cipher School. By January 1945, 10,000 people were employed on the site in a production line dedicated to the decryption, interpretation, analysis, and later the dissemination of enemy signals. It was also the birthplace of modern signals intelligence, bringing together personnel from the three services and civil agencies. Although stripped, the buildings represent the beginning of the information age, with buildings for the Hollerith electromechanical punch cards, electromechanical bombs, and the valve-driven Colossus computer, the world's first programmable computer. And militarily, the information provided by the Allies provided the Allies with invaluable insights into German and Japanese strategy, and laid the foundations of a Cold War intelligence cooperation between the United States and United Kingdom. Contemporary photographs demonstrate the vulnerability of the evidence of the station's activities. Tables, chairs and filing cabinets that could be removed, and even the Hollerith machines simply stood on the floor. Nevertheless, some details such as serving hatches and the remains of message systems betray past workflows. A rapid assessment of each room also allowed diagrams to be quickly produced of areas with original room configurations and areas that might be less sensitive to change. The Second World War was also the first major war that was fought in the radio age. Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the German propaganda minister, considered the radio to be the crucial instrument to influence the masses and encourage the uptake of this new technology for the provision of the Volksempfänger, or people's receiver. But the radio could also be a Trojan horse in every home and dugout, allowing propaganda to undermine civil and army morale. The German broadcasts of Lord Haw were well known. The British also conducted black broadcasting operations through the Political Warfare Executive, PWE. At first, discs were recorded at Wavendon, Towers, Bedfordshire, and then taken to transmitters at Go What in Buckinghamshire or Pottsgrove, Bedfordshire. Probably in 1942, work began on a purpose-built studio at Milton Bryan in Bedfordshire, and Halliday, a portrait painter and broadcaster, designed this recently listed building. From here, live broadcasts were made by a group of prisoners and refugees from the continent and sent to King's Standing, East Sussex, to broadcast. Here, the PWE employed Cecil Williamson, who had pre-war associations with the film industry, to design the buildings. And despite wartime restrictions, the transmitter hall exhibited many Art Deco flourishes, including the extensive use of glass bricks, projecting concrete porch, and internally half-spiral staircase and cone-shaped uplighters. Nicknamed the cinema by workforce, it housed a 600 kilowatt transmitter, and then the largest in the world and inevitably known as Aspidistra. It masqueraded for a variety of German radio stations, including Atlantic Sender and Calais Soldaten Sender, and also broadcast false messages to German night fighters, and a decade ago was the subject of a pioneering study by Ron Martin. Despite the widespread use of wireless, the telephone and telex remain vital. In March 1913, the Defence Teleprinting Network was established, and during the Battle of Britain, most of the links in the command and control train were by landline. Reports from the coastal radar stations were relayed to the filter room at Bentley Priory, Stanmore, and from there to group and sector headquarters. This data was also supplemented by information from the Observer Corps, communicated by landline from the interception of low-level wireless communication. After the order to scramble was given, usually given by telephone, the development of small airborne VHF radio sets allowed fighter controllers to speak directly to the fighters, and fighters pilots to communicate with one another. And this new type of warfare also gave rise to a new piece of apparel for the warrior, a helmet with earphones and a microphone. Typically, at the beginning of the war, an airfield control tower might be equipped with 2 teleprinters, one for receiving meteorological reports and another for communications. Higher level command centres might be equipped with up to 20 teleprinters. The rapid advance in aeronautical communication technology during the war was reflected in more sophisticated ground communications and by a corresponding growth in the size of control towers. By the end of the war, control towers planned for the new very heavy bomber bases with large 3-storey structures designed around communications technology. On the ground floor was a frame room, and elsewhere in the building rooms for the airfield's radar, a weather section, on the top floor consoles for radio controllers with radio links to the aircraft. Communications within the tower were by lamps and tubes, and as flying fields were replaced by concrete runways, airfield lighting was also required. And in addition to the needs of air defence, virtually each army and defence establishment was connected by telephone, the larger ones with private branch exchanges, in some places perhaps with a single telephone, to the extent that during the war the General Post Office laid 5 million miles of underground telephone circuits that represented a third of all cable laid since the late 19th century. For most service personnel, the most important form of communication was a letter from home. With millions of letters moving around the world, this represented a major logistical effort, which required its own dedicated infrastructure. A home postal centre was located at Nottingham and a purpose-built depot at Mill Hill, London. The Americans built a huge 63,000 square metre depot at Long Island City, and England a largely prefabricated depot at Sutton Park. Today, an isolated George VI pillar box remains as a reminder of this huge morale building effort. The new technologies that had entered service towards the end of the war, in particular the jet engine and the rocket, brought in an era where the speed of response might be reduced to minutes. From about 1950, the United Kingdom's air defences were re-established under a project named ROTA. This essentially used updated wartime technology, which was usually located at existing radar stations. A major departure from wartime practice was the provision of underground and surface bunkers. The entry buildings and standby generator houses for these complexes were rendered in the local vernacular. This might have been an attempt to disguise their true function, but also may represent continued concern about the effect of new Air Force buildings on the countryside. Each bunker was a communications hub with generators to power their equipment, an air conditioning plant to remove the heat that was generated by the hundreds of glass valves. A novel feature in these bunkers was the use of suspended floors to accommodate cables and air conditioning ducts. At ground control intercept stations such as Neatishead, Norfolk, Langtoft, Lincolnshire and Hack Green, Cheshire, were remote wireless stations, and further afield repeater stations to boost telex and telephone messages. Under the then current doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the main function of the radar system was to confirm that the country was about to be attacked, to communicate this up through the command chain for the authorisation by the Prime Minister to release the United Kingdom's nuclear response. Due to the timescales that might be measured in minutes, a complex system of landlines, wireless links and duplicate facilities were put in place. But despite all these efforts, the government communications network was still comparatively crude, and in the early 1960s, Prime Minister Macmillan's radio car was forced to rely on the AA's radio network. In this period, this is a false distinction to separate the military and civil communications systems, as in the event of a national emergency, civil networks might be taken over and non-essential subscribers denied access. In the early 1950s, to further strengthen these networks, a new communications link was created with large underground stations exchanges in London, Birmingham and Manchester. The main trunk exchanges were also equipped with large mechanical switchboards. All land-based systems are very vulnerable, and in an attempt to overcome this problem, by the middle of the decade, Work began on the microwave communications system that's generally known as backbone. And similar to the old Semaphore system, it too was a line of sight system, which due to the curvature of the Earth also required relay stations at regular intervals. And as we heard this morning, the most well-known site is the Post Office Tower in London that sits above Museum Exchange. Its distinctive towers are a feature of much of the high ground across the country, with links into more specialised circuits. This system gave a considerable amount of redundancy, and if one tower was lost, the messages might be routed around the other circuits. Most of the structures are fairly utilitarian, but some environmentally sensitive areas, such as the tower at Purdown close to Bristol, received the approval of the Royal Fine Arts Commission. One of the most important communication systems was the central government war room that moved in the late 1950s from London to the former Bathstone quarry at Corsham, Wiltshire. It was to be held on standby until the fateful day when it would be activated by around 4,000 civil servants. In the post-attack phase, its primary role was to coordinate national recovery, but it also might act as the alternative command centre for the authorisation of the release of nuclear weapons. Communications were vital to its task, to receive reports of conditions in the country and the availability of food stocks and other essential supplies. It also needed to issue instructions to the surviving military formations, to assist in the reconstruction effort, and to maintain contact with the emerging regional seats of government. This figure demonstrates the functional areas within the complex and emphasises the importance of the communications, with all the areas in purple are given over to various communications functions. Within the complex is the largest surviving plug-board switchboard in the country, with its associated electromechanical switch rooms, is also now a rare survival. Telephone directories in the group indicate the system was maintained at least to the early 1990s. And within other rooms, telex machines still remain wrapped in plastic bags standing on rotten wooden tables. For internal communications, it was also served by an impressive Lamson tube exchange. Important developments in the 1960s, including greater integration of systems between the services and increased reliance on NATO systems such as the long-distance tropospheric scatter network. The change of NATO doctrine in the 1960s to one of flexible response resulted in a European-wide programme to harden its key assets, and these included hardened telephone exchanges and command centres, where a large proportion of the structure was given over to communications function. The growth in all forms of electronic emissions was a boon for the intelligence community, and from modest beginnings in the early 1950s, it became one of the most significant sources of intelligence. Probably the West's most important Cold War signals intelligence station was Field Station Berlin, positioned high above the city on the Teufelsberg, a huge mound created from wartime rubble. Located in the central group of Soviet forces Germany, it was an ideal monitoring post to detect any signs they might be mobilising for attack. From this site and elsewhere in the city, electronic emissions from the east were constantly harvested, including conversations between aircraft and their controller, radio communications during army exercises, and even high-level political conversations. 20 years since the end of the Cold War, beyond these generalities, we know very little about its activities and how these may have influenced Western policy at crucial moments. When and if details of its intercepts are released, it may revolutionise our understanding of the Cold War as much as the revelation of the cracking of the German Enigma code did for understanding of the Second World War in the 1970s. Although it lay within the British sector, the United States was the dominant partner on the site, and interception activities on the site began in 1961, based in mobile cabins, until it was substantially rebuilt in 1970. The derelict site does, however, give us a rare opportunity to investigate a relatively modern purpose-built communication facility and perhaps understand more about its activities. Our approach was a rapid characterization study, assigning each room to a functional grouping and color-coding diagrams accordingly. We also noted special design features that might provide clues to its form of function. A couple of rooms were lined in copper sheeting or set within large metal shells, effectively creating Faraday cages to prevent the escape of any electronic emissions that might be detected by the east. Features common of many post-war communications buildings, including suspended floors, allowing access for cable ducts and air conditioning systems, and above are suspended ceilings, as we see here, with further air conditioning ducts to carry away the vast amount of heat that is generated by a machine. And this contemporary example at Ash, Kent, gives a good impression with a room with suspended floor and ceiling for the housing of computer equipment, and gives you some idea of what the archaeology of modern communications has to give us. In the post-war world, satellite technology dominates defence communications. The latest British Skynet 5 provides a global system with instantaneous voice, video, data connections between land, sea and air, including a range of welfare communications. This reliance on information technology is also a point of weakness, and cyber warfare is recognised as one of the major threats to this country now, and the United States may even classify cyber attack as an act of war. Given the importance of telecommunications as one of the transformational technology of the 20th century, in the United Kingdom it received very little attention from historians of technology. Why is this a case? On closure of any establishment, the communications equipment is usually quickly removed, in some cases for reasons of national security, for reuse or to realise its scrap value. In increasingly stringent environmental conditions, also control the disposal of telecommunications equipment that might contain, for example, PCBs or radioactive dials. It is these processes that deny us and our successors the raw artefacts for any future studies. An exception is the smashed earthenware insulators that might provide information on the types of equipment that was installed and the names of suppliers. The surviving structures do give some potential for study. In many instances, the basic layout of the rooms might be reconstructed by carefully plotting position of sunken cable conduits, floor and wall mountings, allowing functions to be ascribed to rooms. The forms of these structures also illustrate the architectural response to accommodating this technology as it developed its changing needs, and in the case of military structures, the necessities for protecting vital and fragile equipment. For this reason, the structures tend to be austere and more often protected by blast walls or mounds. Their appearance may belie their form or function. This particular building played a vital role in communication to the nuclear-armed V-Force. If we disregard telephone kiosks, this underappreciation of telecommunication structures is also reflected in relatively few designated examples, which may be measured in low tens. But as with any modern technological structures, recommendations for protection need to be set against a rigorous understanding of their historical, technological and architectural context, and it's something that I hope that this conference has provided. Thank you.